Identifying candidates because the designer must capture an entire range of user behaviors regarding a product. It is critical that the designers identify an appropriately diverse sample of users and user types when planning a series of interviews. Based on information gleaned from stakeholders, SMEs, and literature reviews, designers need to create hypotheses that serve as a starting point in determining what sort of users and potential users to interview. First, the persona hypothesis. The persona hypothesis should be based on likely behavior pattern and the factors that differentiate these patterns, not purely on demographics. So the factors that different these patterns and behavior patterns not purely on demographics. It is often the case with consumer products that demographics are used as screening criteria to select interview subjects. But even in this case, they should serve as a proxy for a hypothesis behavior pattern. Business users are often quite different from consumer users in their behavior patterns and motivations. A corporate customer has different behavior from their consumers. It is a first try at defining the different kinds of users and sometimes uh, customers for a product. The persona hypothesis attempts to address, at a high level, these three questions. What different sorts of people might use this product? How might their needs and behaviors vary? What ranges of behavior and types of environments need to be explored? Roles in business and consumer domains. For business products, roles, common sets of tasks and information needs related to distinct classes of users, provide an important initial organizing principle. For example, for an office phone systems, we might find these rough roles: people who make and receive calls from their desk, people who travel a lot and need to access the phone system remotely, receptionists who answer the phone for many people, people who technically administer the phone system. In business and technical contexts, role often map roughly to job descriptions. Therefore, it is relatively easy to get a reasonable first cut of user types to interview by understanding the kinds of jobs held by users or potential users of the system. Unlike business users, consumers don't have concrete job description and their use of product may cross multiple contexts. Therefore, it often isn't meaningful to use roles as an organizing principle for the persona hypothesis because consumers and their use of product may cross multiple contexts and also because of their attitudes and aptitudes, lifestyle choices, or stage of life. Behavioral and demographic variables. In addition to roles, a persona hypothesis should be based on variables that help differentiate between various kinds of user base on their needs and behaviors. This is often the most useful way to distinguish between different types of users, and it formed the basis for the persona creation process described in the next chapter. Despite the fact that these variables can be difficult to fully anticipate without research, they often become the basis of the persona hypothesis for consumer products. For example, for an online store, we might identify several ranges of behavior concerning shopping, frequency of shopping from frequent to infrequent, So these are the behaviors that a persona hypothesis should be based, that could have a variables that help differentiate between various kinds of users based on their needs and behaviors. This is often the most useful way to distinguish between different types of users, and it forms the basis for the persona creation process that we will describe next. So this is the most useful actually to find this behavior pattern for your persona. Despite the fact that these variables can be difficult to fully anticipate without research, they often become the basis of the persona hypothesis for consumer products. For example, for an online store, we might identify several ranges of behavior concerning shopping: frequency of shopping from frequent to infrequent, desire to shop from loves to shop to hates to shop, motivation to shop from bargain hunting to searching for just the right item. Although consumer user types can often be roughly defined by the combination of behavioral variables they map to, behavioral variables are also important for identifying types of business and technical users. So it's also helpful to define a combination of behavioral variables they map to. And behavior variables are also important for identifying types of business and technical users. People with a single business role definition may have different needs and motivations. Behavioral variables can capture this, although often not until user data has been gathered, because we're trying to differentiate between different people, whether it's business user, consumer, and their pattern of behavior and their the most common user that use our product are most often a combination of these different people, but there should be a science or pattern that will emerge, which we're gonna discuss later, that allows them to use the product compared to competitors. Given the difficulty in accurately anticipating behavioral variables before user data is gathered, another helpful approach in building a persona hypothesis is making use of demographic variables. When planning your interviews, you can use market research to identify ages, locations, genders, and incomes of the target markets for the product. Interviewees should be distributed across these demographic ranges in the hope of interviewing a sufficiently diverse group of people to identify the significant behavior patterns. So because it's difficult to accurately anticipating these variables, their behaviors of this different user before a user data is gathered in interview, another helpful approach is building a persona hypothesis. Aside from persona hypothesis, making use of demographic variables. So how these characteristics of this demographic vary. When planning your interview, you can use market research to identify ages, location, gender, incomes of the target markets of the product. Interviewees should be distributed across these demographic ranges in the hope of interviewing a sufficiently diverse group of people to identify the significant behavior patterns. Domain expert versus technical expertise. Depending on who the design target of the product is, domain support may be a necessary part of the product design, as well as technical ease of use. A relatively naive user will likely never be able to use more than a small subset of domain-specific product functions. So a naive user or a new user will never be able to use more than a small subset of functions. So depending on the design target, sometimes you need someone that has huge domain knowledge or domain-specific product functions without domain support provided in the interface. If naive users are part of the target market for a domain-specific product, care must be taken to support domain naive behaviors if they are not domain aware. So environmental consideration, a final consideration, especially in the case of business product, is the cultural differences between organization in which the users are employed. So different users of their product, different behavior pattern uh, is in environmental consideration. So before you create this persona hypothesis, you need to consider this domain expertise, environmental consideration, behavior and demographic variables, roles in business and consumer domains. So at small companies, for example, workers tend to have a broader set of responsibilities and more interpersonal contact. Huge companies often have multiple layers of bureaucracy, and their workers tend to be highly specialized. Like behavioral variables, this may be difficult to identify without some domain research because patterns vary significantly by industry and geographic region. Here are some examples of these environmental variables. Company size from small to multinational, company location, North America, Europe, Asia, and so on, industry or sector, electronics, manufacturing, consumer package, and so on, IT presence from ad hoc to draconian, security level from lax to tight. Putting together a plan. After that, you need to create an interview plan that can be communicated to the person in charge of coordinating and scheduling the interviews. In our practice, we've observed that for enterprise or professional products, each presumed behavioral pattern requires about half a dozen interviews to verify or refute. So each behavior pattern that we have gotten from persona hypothesis, stakeholder interviews, SME and literature, or that thesis of behavior pattern that will help us to create persona, it will take half a dozen interview to verify if that pattern really exists and if we need to dig deep on that in persona, especially if the domain is complex. What this means is in practice is that each identified role, behavioral variable, demographic variable, and environmental variable identified in the persona hypothesis should be explored in 4 to 6 interviews. However, these interviews can overlap. Suppose we believe that use of an enterprise product may differ by geographic location, industry, and company size. Research at a single small electronic manufacturer in Taiwan would allow us to cover several variables at once. By being clever about mapping variables to interviewee screening profiles, you can keep the interviews to a manageable number. So if you map this behavioral pattern to the right interviewee, you can keep this interview manageable. Suppose that you have an enterprise product that may differ by geographic location, industry, and company size. So research at a small electronics manufacturer in Taiwan would cover several behavioral variables. Consumer products typically have much more variation in behavior, so more interviews typically are required to really delineate the differences about these behavior patterns, because remember, we're trying to create personas that will be useful for the design. A good rule of thumb is to double the numbers just discussed, 8 to 12 interviews for each user type postulated in the persona hypothesis. As before, a complex consumer product may occasionally require even more interviews to accurately capture the range of behaviors and motivations. So again, we're capturing the behaviors of these groups and the motivation or their goals. Sometimes to keep in mind with consumer products is that lifestyle choices and life stages, single marriage, young children, older children, empty nest, can multiply the interviews for certain kinds of products. So because these lifestyle stages is highly related to the behavior patterns and motivation of this group. So it will multiply the number of interview that you need to do. So especially for consumer product lifestyle choices or different lifestyle of people and their life stages, highly is highly interrelated on how they buy things. Conducting ethnographic interviews, if stakeholders can help you get in touch with users, you can contact a market or usability research firm that specialize in finding people for surveys and focus groups. These firms are useful for reaching consumers and diverse demographics. The difficulty with this approach is that it can sometimes be challenging to find interviewees who will permit you to interview them in their homes or places of work. As an alternative for consumer products, designer can recruit friends and relatives. This makes it easy to observe the interviewees in a natural environment, but also is quite limiting as far as diversity of demographic and behavioral variables are concerned. So you can recruit your friends and relatives. It will make the easier to observe interviews in their natural environment, but it's limiting in diversity. In terms of the diversity, interview teams and timing, the authors favor a team of 2 designers per interview. The moderator drives the interview and take like notes, and facilitator takes detailed notes and looks for any holes in the questioning. So the facilitator take notes for the moderator and look for holes in the way moderator question it, and they can switch as well. 1 hour per user interviewed is often sufficient, except in the case of complex domains such as medical, scientific, and financial services. This may require more time to fully understand what the user is trying to accomplish. So again, in this interview, we're trying to find the behavior patterns. So the way to actually find the behavior pattern is to identify goals. So what are their goals based on those demographic variables, environmental variables. So later we will discuss that in persona. Be sure to budget travel time between interview sites. This is especially true for consumer interviews in residential neighborhoods or interview that involve shadowing users as they interact with a usually mobile product while moving from place to place. So sometimes you actually shadow the users and then while finding the motivation of doing something that triggers that behavior habit. Teams should try to limit interviews to 6 per day. Phases of ethnographic interviews. The approach of the interviews in each successive phase is slightly different from the previous one, reflecting the growing knowledge of user behaviors that result from each additional interview. So you're getting a clearer and clearer picture based on that previous interview. Focus tend to be broad at the start, aimed at the gross structural and goal-oriented issues. So first, you're finding what is the pattern or the motivation, the why behind the reason, the customer behavior, and more narrow for interviews at the end of the cycle, zooming in on specific functions and task-oriented issues. Early interviews are exploratory in nature and focus on gathering domain knowledge from the user's point of view. You're actually looking on the why, the one that is not being said. So based on this behavior patterns from different users. So you're trying to ask question based on stakeholder SMEs, this interview with users, what's really that driving that behavior, right? Based on the exercise chapter that we've discussed, we can actually achieve immediately everything in social media, but that may not be the case for your users. So you really need to ask why, what's really keeping them at night, you know. Early interviews are exploratory in nature and focus on gathering domain knowledge from the user's point of view. Broad, open-ended questions are common with a lesser degree of a drill down into details. So open-ended are common in early interview. Middle interviews are where designers begin to see patterns of use and ask open-ended and clarifying questions to help connect the dots. Because remember, this is what we're trying to really see the implicit knowledge, just like in inductive gathering, qualitative gathering in the previous book. It's like also in dialogue data, in which we need to find that implicit cue or the hidden meaning behind their behavior. So questions in general are more focused on domain specifics now that designers have absorbed the domain's basic rules, structures, and vocabularies. Late interviews confirm previously observed patterns, further clarifying user roles and behaviors and making fine adjustments to assumptions about task and information needs. More close-ended questions are used, tying up loose ends in the data. After you have an idea who your interviewers will be, it will be useful to work with stakeholders to schedule individuals most appropriate for each phase in the interview cycle. For example, in a complex technical domain, it's often a good idea to perform early interviews with more patient and articulate interview subjects. In some cases, you may also want to look back and interview this particularly knowledgeable and articulate subject again at the end of the interview cycle to address any topics you were unaware of during your interview. So after that, before you do that initial, middle, and late interview, it can be useful to work with stakeholders to schedule that with them. And after that, you may loop back with that stakeholder to at the end of the interview cycle to address any topics you were unaware of during your initial interview. Basic methods. The basic methods of ethnographic interviewing are simple, straightforward, and very low tech, although the nuances of interviewing subjects take some time to master. Any practitioner should, if he or she follows this suggestion, would be rewarded with a wealth of useful qualitative data. Interview where the interaction happens. Following the first principle of contextual inquiry, it is of critical importance that subjects be interviewed in the places where they actually use the products. Not only does this allow the interviewers to witness the product being used, but it also gives the interview team access to the team environment in which the interaction occurs. This can give you a tremendous insight into product constraints and user needs and goals. Notice, for example, the kind of information he needs: papers on his desk or adhesive notes on his screen border. So you need to notice these little things while interviewing, or things that you may not notice in another environment. Because remember, environment are different from just doing the research, because our environment are complex adaptive systems. So like paper on his desk or adhesive notes on his screen border, inadequate system, cheat sheets, and user manuals. The frequency and priority of tasks inbox and outbox, and the kind of workflows he follows: memos, charts, calendars. So you can find the workflow he follows and how efficient or how he structure his memos, charts, calendars, his productivity up, the frequency and priority of his task in his inbox and outbox. Email. Avoid a fixed set of questions. The entire premise of ethnographic interviews and contextual queries that we, as interviewers, don't know enough about the domain to presuppose the questions that need asking. Here are some goal-oriented questions to consider. Goals: what makes a good day? A bad day? Opportunity: what activities currently waste your time? Priorities: what is most important to you? So again, these are the common reason why the user wants to use our product is to be productive, uh, or to achieve their priority, or their goal. Information: what helps you make decisions. Another useful type of question is the system-oriented question. So aside from that, the goal, there's also information that makes the customer achieve his goal. So another useful type of question is the system-oriented question. Function: what are your most common things you do with the product? Frequency: what parts of the product do you use most? Preference: what are your favorite aspects of the product? What drives you crazy? Failure: how do you work around problem? Expertise: what shortcuts do you employ? So sometimes the customer may feel frustrated on the product and experience edge cases. So you need to ask, how do you work around that problem? Expertise: what shortcut do you employ? Uh, is it intermediate or expert? For business products, workflow-oriented questions can be helpful. Process: what did you do when you first came in today? What did you do after that? Occurrence and recurrence: how often do you do this? What things do you do weekly or monthly, but not every day? Exception: what constitutes a typical day? What would be an unusual event? To better understand users' motivations, you can employ attitude-oriented questions. Aspiration: what do you see yourself doing 5 years from now? Avoidance: what would you prefer not to do? What do you procrastinate on? What do you enjoy most about your job or lifestyle? What do you always tackle first? So it's just like a lifestyle design, right? What is the most important to the user? Like, what is his ideal day? What does the user do daily? Assume the role of an apprentice, not an expert. Your goal is to omnivoorously and non-judgmentally absorb everything your interviewers want to tell you, to encourage them to actively engage in detailed, thoughtful explanations. Don't be afraid to ask naive questions. They put people at ease. So a naive questions, like a beginner questions, don't be afraid to ask that, because you'll be surprised how often seemingly silly questions end up pushing past assumptions and led to real insights. Be sympathetic and receptive listener, and you'll find that people will be willing to share almost any kind of information with you. Use open-ended and close-ended questions to direct discussion. Open-ended questions encourage detailed responses from the interviewee. Use this type of question to elicit more detail about a topic on which you need to gather more information. Typical open-ended question begin with why, how, or what. So why, how, and what. So that's the typical open-ended. After an interviewee answers your close-ended questions, usually a natural pause in the conversation occur. So after the interview answer the open-ended, you can ask the close-ended to direct the discussion to a new line of questioning using a new open-ended question. Focus on goals and first and task second. Unlike contextual inquiry and the majority of Other qualitative research methods. The first priority of ethnographic interviewing is understanding the why of users. You need to know what motivates the behavior of individuals in different roles and how they hope to ultimately accomplish this goal, not the what of the task they perform. Understanding the task is important and the task must be recorded diligently, but this task will ultimately be restructured to better match user goals in the final design. Avoid making the user a designer. Guide the interviewee toward examining problems and far away from expressing solutions. Most of the time, those solutions reflect the interviewee's subject personal priorities. Although they sound good to him, they tend to be short-sighted and idiosyncratic. That said, a proposed design solution can be a useful jumping off point to discuss a user's goal and the problem he encounters with the current system. If a user blurts out an interesting idea, ask, what problem would that solve for you? Instead of proposing the solution, why would that be a good solution? Avoid discussing technology. In case of technical scientific products, where technology is always an issue, distinguishing between domain-related technology and product-related technology, and steer away from the latter. If an interview subject insists on talking about how the product should be implemented, return to his goals and motivation by asking, how would that help you? Why would that be a good solution? So encourage storytelling. Far more useful than asking users for design advices and encouraging them to tell specific stories about their experiences with the product, whether an old version of the one you're redesigning or analogous product or process. So rather than having them propose solution, because some of them is expert and then some of them are beginner and a lot of them is intermediate, ask them to provide a story on what is really driving the behavior. Ask them how they use it, what they think of it, who else they interact with when using it, where they go with it, and so forth. Detailed stories of this kind usually are the best way to understand how users relate to and interact with the product. Encourage stories that deal with typical cases and also more exceptional ones. Ask for a show and tell. After you have a good idea of the flow and structure of a user activities and interactions, it's useful to ask for a show and tell related to design problem. This can be domain related artifacts, software interfaces, paper systems, tours of the work environment, or ideally all of this. So things that they may want to add, the software interface, the tour in their environment, etc. Be sure not just to record the artifacts themselves, digital. So this is the time that you should video it at this stage to record the IDE and tools that the user use. Also pay attention how the interviewee describes them. As you look to capture artifacts from the user's environment, be on particular lookout for signs of unmet needs or failures in the existing design. For example, a scientist actually about the experiments other than sequential ID number. So this only recorded sequential ID number. If the paper notebook were lost, the experimental result would be nearly useless. So because the ID number meant nothing to users, this clearly was unmet user need. So you can provide that feature next time, since it's unmet user needs at the scientist's point of view, not just the sequential ID number. So you can maybe provide other things that would help him based on what you see. Avoid leading questions. Here are some examples of leading questions. Would feature X help you? You like X, don't you? Do you think you'd use feature X if it were available? Does X seem like a good idea to you? So again, you're adding feature or you're designing something on the system. That's why you're asking this question. So you're trying to help the company or the user find better achieve their goals that will allow you to get the business goals, which is adding more revenue. So that's actually how simple design added more revenue in the website or web application or desktop app. After each interview, the teams compare notes and discuss any particular interesting trends observed or specific points brought up in the most recent interview. If they have the time, they should also look back at old notes to see whether unanswered questions from other interviews and research have been answered properly. This information should be used to strategize about the approach to take in subsequent interviews. Again, the reflections is needed. After the interview process is finished, the design team should make a pass through all the notes, marking or highlighting trends and patterns in the data. This is actually called coding. This is very useful for the next step of creating persona. So this is the coding that we've talked about in the previous book in qualitative research. So you need to find pattern based on those reflections after you've done this interview on things that you could add more on what's really driving the behavior and how you can efficiently solve the solution based on integrated um, views from different uh, stakeholders. So this marking, when it also observed organizing the mark responses into topic groups, is called coding by serious ethnographers. Although that level of organization usually is overkill, it may be useful for complex domains. Um, Other types of qualitative research. The majority of this chapter has focused on the qualitative research techniques we employ to construct the robust user and domain models described in the next chapter. So all of this data will be used for us to construct the pattern that we will gonna use for to achieve the user persona on the common pattern and then user that we are trying to serve, most notably intermediate users, and then use this as a basis to communicate to stakeholders. So design and usability professionals incorporate many other forms of research, ranging from detailed task analysis to focus group and usability tests. While these activities may indeed contribute to the creation of useful and desirable products, we have found that goal-directed approach described earlier provide the biggest buck with less effort. Put simply, goal-directed approach helps answer questions about the product at the both big picture and functional detail level with a relatively small amount of effort and expense. So you go up and down because you look at every stakeholder's perspective and find a pattern. Focus groups, often the meeting is recorded on audio or video media for later reference. These are useful for initial reactions to a product form, its visual appearance, or industrial design. Focus groups excel at eliciting information about products that people own or are willing or unwilling to purchase, but they are weak at gathering data about what people actually do with those products or how and why they do it. So this can be combined by this goal-directed research, but this is not the be-all and all. The majority or loudest opinion often becomes the group opinion. This is counterproductive for an interaction design process where designer must understand all different pattern of behavior a product must address. Usability testing. So this is actually how you find a product of a great design, because those designers check on all this perspective and try to balance that. Usability testing. Typically, usability testing is focused on measuring how well users can complete specific standardized tasks as well as what problems they encounter in doing so. Results often reveal areas where users have problems understanding and using the product, as well as places where users are more likely to be successful. Whether you are testing production software, a clickable prototype, or even a paper prototype, the point of the test is to validate a product design. This means that appropriate place for usability testing is quite late in the design cycle, after there is a coherent concept and sufficient detail to generate such prototype. See previous video for interaction, visual, and industrial design. So you can see the previous video for this interaction, visual, and industrial design for creating this usability testing, because this may be good, but see, if we have limited budget, it may not be uh, good at the start. So we need to make do of our little resources. We certainly do that in the beginning, but often we find that we can better assess product inadequacies through our qualitative studies. Perhaps the budget is limited in a way that allows usability testing only once in a product design initiative. Card sorting, so another that we can add with this goal-directed research popularized by information architects. Card sorting is a technique to understand how users organize information and concepts. Although the technique has a number of variations, it is typically performed by asking users to sort a desk of cards, each containing a piece of functionality or information related to the product or website. This technique assumes a lot because while this can be a valuable tool to uncover one aspect of a user's mental model, the technique assumes that the subject has refined organizational skills and will sort it to correlate to how we will end up wanting to use the product. So this card sorting assumes that the user will organize how he will end up wanting to use the product. Unfortunately, many times it doesn't. One way to enhance the value of card sort studies to debrief the subject afterwards to understand any organizational principles he has employed in his sort, again attempting to understand his mental model. Ultimately, we believe that product-conducted open-ended interviews can explore these aspects of the user's mental model more effectively. By asking the right questions and paying close attention to how a subject explains his activities and domain, you can decipher how he mentally associates different bits of functionality and information. Task analysis. Task analysis are usually consist of questionnaires or open-ended interviews to develop detailed understanding of how people currently perform specific tasks. Once the questionnaires are compiled or the interviews are completed, tasks are formally decomposed and analyzed. Typically, they are incorporated into a flow chart or similar diagram that communicate the relationships between actions and often the relationship between people and processes. We find that this type of inquiry should be incorporated into ethnographic user interviews. So this task analysis, where it has questionnaires and open-ended interviews to develop understanding of people of how they currently perform tasks, is actually helpful for ethnographic in goal-directed design. So once the questionnaire are complied or interviews are completed, tasks are decomposed and analyzed. Typically, it is created into a flowchart or a similar diagram that communicates the relationships of tasks between people and processes. Furthermore, as we'll discuss in the next chapter, the analysis activities are a useful part of modeling activities. Task analysis is a critical way of understanding how users currently do something as well as identifying pain points and opportunities for improvement. However, task analysis does little to illuminate user goals. How do people do things today is often a product of the obsolete system and organization they force to interact with. Research is critical to good design. If you do the work of good research, your product will benefit and you'll avoid wasting time and resources. Putting a product to the test in a lab to see whether it passes or fails may provide a lot of data but not necessarily a lot of value. Using ethnographic interviews at the beginning of the process allow you as a designer to truly understand your users, their needs, and their motivations. Once you have a solid design concept based on qualitative user research and the models that research feeds your usability testing, will become an even more efficient tool for judging effectiveness of design choices you have made. Goal-directed design research allow you to do the heavy lifting early in the process.